You know, no matter how much you read about the hot button political storms, when you live in a small town, you're never quite prepared for them to show up in your backyard. There are few things more politicized right now than trans people. And by extension, anything that the right is able to shove under the umbrella of gender ideology. At this point, that is kind of a smaller umbrella that's been partially shoved under the larger umbrella of DEI, but it still gets plenty of heat all on its own. They them pronouns, gender ideology, acknowledgement of the full and rich and well documented history of non binary identities from across the world throughout time, gender ideology. Use the word cisgender to describe someone who identifies as the gender they were assigned at birth and therefore making an accurate descriptor, gender ideology, and also apparently a slur if you're still on Twitter. Also, if you're still on Twitter, why? But then, somehow, more divisive than all of them, there's Drag Story Hour. Few things fire up the right, like someone with an atypical, exaggerated, or gender flip presentation interacting in any way with children. They call it indoctrination, they call it grooming, they call it child abuse. And even in a town where the norm is tolerance, if not acceptance, a Drag Story Hour event can bring out so much vitriol that wasn't in clear evidence before. So what I want to talk about is what happened when Drag Story Hour came to my area. Partly as a general documentation, but also to talk about the misinformation, the anger, and the ignorance that turns a simple, fun event into a lightning rod. Drag Story Hour, originally called Drag Queen Story Hour, but they broadened it because they do have other performers who aren't queens sometimes, is a thing that began in 2015, and it is also exactly what it says on the tin. Drag performers will hold events aimed at families with young kids and read them books about acceptance, tolerance, and the importance of being yourself. Lessons that should, in theory, be non-controversial, but of course, queerness of any kind in the presence of children has always been controversial, regardless of what was actually happening. And as the program spread nationally, it picked up what I think is best described as devoted haters. I could list you far too many events where drag performers or librarians, since these events are usually held at libraries, were harassed or had their lives threatened. But I'm not trying to give a full history of the event as an overall thing. I'm going to narrow down to something I was actually there for and lived through. For context, I live in a part of Vermont broadly referred to as the Northeast Kingdom. Fun fact, Queen of the Northeast Kingdom is one of my burlesque taglines, if you've ever seen me perform. But as the name Northeast Kingdom would imply, it is the northeast corner of the state, and while there's plenty of small towns spread all across Vermont, the Northeast Kingdom, or NEK, is made up of almost nothing but small towns. Towns in the NEK top out at 7,400 people and get as small as under 300. And in the southern part of the NEK is its largest town, St. Johnsbury. St. Johnsbury has its ups and downs throughout its history, especially economically speaking, but it's persevered partially through being the largest town in the area and having a handful of institutions that stand proudly. There is St. Johnsbury Academy, which serves not only as the local high school, but also is noted enough to lure in international students from across the world. There's the Fairbanks Museum, which is over 130 years old and is home to the local meteorologists whose forecasts are used across the state. And there is the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. It's over 150 years old. It is a combination library and art gallery. And on November 16th, 2024, it hosted a Drag Queen Story Hour. But before we get to the event itself, we really need to talk about the lead up. Now, I'm going to be referencing a local NEK newspaper a fair bit in this video, and After some soul searching, I have made the choice to not name the paper in question, nor the people who wrote the articles I'll be citing, nor indeed most of the names of the people quoted in those articles. Now, it wouldn't be hard to find this stuff if it really matters to you, but ultimately, while I'm going to be fairly critical of some of the paper's reporting in the lead up to the event, as well as what was said by multiple local residents that got cited in the paper, I don't actually have an axe to grind on this issue, especially not with the newspaper. It's honestly amazing that an area this rural still has a circulating daily paper, and I don't want it to ever go away. And frankly, my channel subscriber count is about double the paper circulation. I'm not saying that to boast. I'm saying it because if I were to name names, I would honestly feel like a bully. And I am not looking to turn the internet against my neighbors. But the newspaper is where we are going to start. And it's where we're also going to spend a fair bit of time. So that means we are going to start with the weekend edition for November 9th and 10th and a front page article, which was titled Athenaeum Drag Story Hour Event Draws Critics. Now, only the first few paragraphs are actually on the front page itself, and then it moves to the interior of the paper. A fairly common thing in practice with papers like this, especially if it isn't the main front page story. And if all you checked were those first few paragraphs on the front page, it might not seem too bad. It starts largely just by announcing the event, giving the date, the time, a little bit of the event announcement copy. Yeah, the article calls the upcoming event, quote, the latest controversial chapter of a local drag story hour. And while that feels unnecessary, I also can't say that it's inaccurate to call the event controversial, whether you're talking about Drag Story Hour in general or the Vermont branch in specific. But then, if you go and open up the paper and go to where the article continues, things go downhill, and they go downhill pretty quick. I could make an argument that focusing on the controversy that often follows Drag Story Hour is already a bad sign. I think that'd be a little disingenuous of me to do, though. The fact is, the controversy is real. And as far as reporting goes, talking about that is what would elevate it from a generic event announcement, something happening in the town, to an actual news story. And talking about something being controversial doesn't automatically mean that an article will be unbalanced or harmful or anything like that. This one is those things, though. The construction and makeup of the article is interesting, and I don't know how much of what I'm going to talk about was done deliberately and how much of it was just how it ended up. I'm going to be refraining from speculating on intent and instead just focus as much as I can on the end result, because I can't read anybody's mind and I'm not going to accuse anybody of intending to do or not do certain things. There are a few factors that can, at a glance, make the article seem more balanced than it actually is. And if someone wanted to defend against my accusations of bias and unbalanced reporting, here are the things they would probably point out. There's a total of 5 people who are quoted throughout the body of the article. 3 of them express negative sentiment about the upcoming event. 2 of them express positive sentiment. Now, in the purest sense, that is unbalanced, since there's one more person speaking negatively than speaking positively, but I actually don't want to harp on that. Plus, if you were to drill down further, you would realize that the quotes from people being negative comprise 340 words of the article. The quotes from people who are speaking more positively about it total 346 words. So despite a small disparity in how many people are representing each side, that would seem pretty balanced. But there's more to the people being quoted than just how many represent each side or how many of their words were used, because, you see, the 3 people speaking negatively are residents of either the town where the event was planned or of towns close enough to be considered local. And the 2 people speaking positively are the director of the Athenaeum, the library where the event's going to take place, and the director of a library in a neighboring town that had previously hosted a drag story hour. So what is created is a picture of angry locals who don't want this in their town and the library staff who are bringing it to them anyways. It paints not only the event as an outside force coming to the town, but that the people bringing it to town are also subtly painted as outsiders, since they are not described in terms of being local or being residents, but rather in terms of their jobs. One could even argue the only reason they're defending the events is to protect their jobs now that people are angry, not because they actually think it's good for the community they themselves are actually a part of, but we're not going to talk about how they are also part of this community. Additionally, if you were paying attention, you might have noticed something's kind of missing here. Neither drag queen who hosted the event was quoted. In fact, they were not even contacted. And I know that because I asked them.
I am Justin Marsh. I use they, them pronouns in my regular day-to-day, and I perform as Emoji Nightmare, she, her, and I live in Cambridge, Vermont.
Hi, everyone. My performer name is Katniss Everqueer. I use she, her pronouns.
I was not privy to the article, the first one, and because they have their publication behind a paywall, and I'm not a resident of that area, I didn't have subscription, so I was relying on actually a friend of mine who lives in Orleans County who had a subscription to provide me with access so that I could even read the things that they were saying about us.
We just got word that it was out and read it, and and it didn't feel like it was the most unbiased reporting we'd ever heard on one of our events.
They had interviewed us before for different stories, so they knew how to reach us. So it was a little interesting that their first the first time covering it, that we were basically ignored.
Now, full disclosure, this is not my first time speaking with either of these people. Emoji, I've known for years, and we've been in a few shows together. Katniss is one of my dearest friends in the area, so I won't pretend that I'm unbiased in this. But I wanted to have their voices here, especially since they were initially left out of the story, treated not so much as people, but only as an event that was coming to the town.
It wasn't just us who weren't interviewed for that first one. It was also really anyone in support of the event. It really, they didn't talk to parents who were excited about it. They didn't talk to local businesses, many of whom rallied around the story hour. They only talked to one of the librarians, not the children's librarian, who was the primary organizer of this. I think they really just spoke to the main librarian, who was trying to, I think, offer as much of a kind of neutral stance as possible. I think they spoke to detractors and folks who had really put a lot of energy into working against this event.
In the interest of fairness, I did also reach out to the author of the original article, the one that we are still talking about right now, who is also someone who I know personally. We were actually in a few plays together back when I was more involved in local community theater in the area, which was also back when I was still presenting as male. So we haven't really had all that much interaction since I started a full hormone regimen and, started looking like myself. But I reached out to see if they were willing to answer any questions or wanted to make any comment. And I have debated what to do with the reply that I got, because I did get a reply, so it would be untrue for me to say that there was no comment. The thing was, when I asked if I could take what was sent to me as an official statement or a position on the matter, I was never given a clear answer on that. So I don't know if it's actually appropriate for me to quote it. What I've decided to do is not cite the comment or quote it here, which honestly won't really impact the video anyway, because what I got back didn't really directly address all that much. But I did just want it noted that I tried to give voice to the original article writer, but they would not clarify to me if it was okay to use what response they gave. So we're just going to have to move on at this point. On top of neither drag performer being contacted, much less interviewed for this original article, there's an apparent lack of any queer voices in the article at all. Now, I say apparent lack because I would come to learn over the course of all this that the director of the library in the neighboring town, the one which had previously hosted a drag story hour prior to this event that was upcoming at the time, that person is non-binary. You wouldn't know that from the article where they are quoted because she, her pronouns were used and it otherwise does not identify them as queer in any way. So while technically having one full quote and two partial quotes from a member of the local queer community, that doesn't actually change the optics that you get from just reading the article, which, unless you know the library director personally, those optics are that a bunch of cisgender people are talking about queer people without involving them in the discussion. And it's made worse by the fact that the library director in question does use they, them pronouns. And no, I'm not guessing at that. I know because I asked. I sent a very quick email to them noting that I was working on this video and that I would be referencing them and wanted to know what their preferred pronouns were so that I could be sure I got it right. This is apparently something the local paper appears to have never asked. That is an assumption on my part. I didn't inquire on whether or not they did. But regardless of whether or not this was something they looked into, the paper did end up misgendering them, albeit most likely through carelessness rather than malice, but still. But let's back up to how all of this was presented. The first person actually quoted is the director of the Athenaeum, who said this: "The people who call me or email me have been, at least in person-to-person conversation, pretty reasonable. They express directly why they're opposed to it. They think this is some kind of sexual act. It's grooming children, or it's misogyny." And the immediate follow-up to that sentence is the words,
"It is misogyny,"
which don't appear in quotes despite being credited to a local, who, for today's video, we will be calling Karen. Before we get our first proper quote from Karen, she is identified as a town resident and mother of 4. And then, after her first extended quote, she's noted as a taxpayer. This is relevant because the Athenaeum is funded by local taxes. This is that thing that I mentioned before, where her residence and status as a mother is established in order to give more weight to her words as a member of the community and establishing her roots, as opposed to the library director, who is never identified as anything other than just the person who has that job. Now, I mentioned how the Athenaeum's budget comes from local taxes. It's a budget item the voters give a straight yes or no vote to each year. Karen notes that she'll be voting down the Athenaeum's annual budget request over this particular matter.
"This is a breach of trust. Having this event makes us feel like the library's not a safe place. Some of us are feeling that very strongly. Some are feeling very betrayed."
And there is an interesting order of how things are presented. Because right after Karen's quote about no longer supporting the budget for the Athenaeum, the paper states that the organization's annual budget is $115,000, which is a jarring number to see in a place like the NEK, which is not particularly prosperous. It can't help but feel like the article is kind of implying this person thinks the budget should be voted down, and look how much is going to something like this thing that a resident doesn't even want. Now, if you think I'm being a little harsh in this reading, I'm going to draw attention to the fact of how far away from that budget number of $115,000 a year the article has decided to place a pretty important detail. That detail being the event wasn't even paid for with the Athenaeum's budget. The library director paid for it out of pocket in the vain hope that it would allay the concerns of upset locals. That is a pretty important detail, and there are 4 paragraphs between someone bringing up the budget and the article stating what that budget is, and this fact. Now, in the interest of getting so much nastiness out of the way, we're going to burn through the rest of the quotes given by Karen, as well as those from two other people who we are going to call Becky and Guy. One more thing I'll note. While Becky and Karen are from the immediate area where the event was to be held, Guy is from 2 towns over. Now, that is not an unreasonable distance when you're talking about Vermont. It's certainly within the readership of the paper, but I don't know. Can't help but give a little bit of the impression, accurate or not, the paper had to go out of their way to find a third person who was upset. I also have no idea how they even came to find these people in the first place, but since I don't know, we'll move on. Anyway, hold your nose, we'll dive in.
The drag culture is a mockery of femininity and womanhood, and mocking and degrading people is wrong whenever it happens. It's wrong when Donald Trump does it. It's wrong when it's a brothel full of human slaves who have been trafficked into our country for the sexual pleasure of perverts. It's always wrong to exploit.
While these performers may be very nice people, speaking to young children about gender, homosexuality, etc. is not right.
I think that it is not in line with the dignity of the Athenaeum to host and promote such a thing. The Athenaeum is a beacon in our community of history, of culture, of knowledge, of beauty. There is nothing within drag culture that is in line with the image and the esteem of the Athenaeum.
We live in a time where old-time values and lifestyles are being replaced by deviant behavior.
It's confusing, and it creates a crisis in their conscience that is avoidable. Why would we do that to children? Why would we confuse them?
I have nothing against the 2 gentlemen that are performing. That's their choice as adults. It's just very disappointing that the Athenaeum feels like it has to embrace this woke agenda that's really quite harmful in my opinion.
The realm of children should be wholesome because they are naive. And because they're naive, that naivete in them needs to be guarded with wisdom. And flaunting in front of them men who are exaggeratedly exploiting femininity and womanhood is not helpful for children. It's not helpful for their mentality about women, about themselves. It's degrading.
And it is championed by leftists.
Having stories read to children by a person dressed provocatively in a sexually exaggerated manner is not wholesome, gentle, or wise, no matter who is doing it or how. It is never appropriate for children to be exposed to provocatively dressed people in person or images. It is always inappropriate and falls in the category of sexual abuse. It is not neutral. It is the grooming of minors for future abuse. Every year, our co-op members undergo child SAGE training to learn how to spot and guard against sexual predators in our community. Every year, we relearn that it is considered sexual abuse to expose children to sexually provocative images or people. People who do that are predators. They are grooming children and desensitizing them to sexual things. Our insurance company requires us to have this training. Does the Athenaeum's insurance company know they are hosting a drag story hour? Does the staff of the Athenaeum have to undergo training on how to spot and avoid sexual predators?
It's time to stand up for the children and let them be just that. Children.
There is a time and a season for people to grapple with certain ideas. The season of life when a child would attend events at a children's library is not the right season for them to grapple with the idea of a drag queen named Emoji Nightmare. This is activism. This is divisive. It is hurtful. If the door opens to this, where will they draw the line? It is understood that no one is required to attend the event that does not desire to do so. However, the Athenaeum directors and trustees must understand that hosting and promoting an event like this aimed at children is damaging to relationships. Why are they hosting an event they know will push many people away?
And so I get to exercise my choice by saying, I'm not going to support that institution.
Perhaps they believe they are operating with good intentions. Whatever those intentions are, they are misguided at best, and this is not the best way to express them. For the sake of all children, the Athenaeum's dignity and the relationship they have with this community, I plead with them to please reconsider.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I'd like to say we won't have to do that again, but I don't want to lie to you. We are going to have to circle back and take a closer look at a few of these. Plus, I'm also going to be going over some of the letters to the editor that came in later. It's not going to be quite that again. I'm not going to read you or have anyone else read you the full contents of those, but there will be more. But for now, let's pull up the quote from Becky that we heard. Now, as unsurprising and disappointing as the woke agenda, part of that is I'd actually rather focus on how it starts.
I have nothing against the two gentlemen that are performing. That's their choice as adults.
Now, there's a problem with this, and that is the fact that the performers who were coming were not two gentlemen. While both of the drag queens who were going to host the event use she, her pronouns in performance, Emoji Nightmare is non-binary. Now, I'm sure there are some folks scoffing at that and going, well, that's not a real thing anyways. I'm not counting that. And even if that is your position, you still have the fact that Katniss Everqueer is a cisgender woman. Because yes, not all drag queens identify as men off stage or were assigned male at birth.
People assume that I am a cis man. I think especially in internet rhetoric, like a lot of times, Emoji and I joke we've actually been identified as probably not every, because gender is such a broad spectrum and there's so many identities, but we've been called cis men, we've been called trans men, we've been called trans women, we have people who've said, Emoji's a cis woman. So people misgender us both all the time. What isn't novel is that people are fascinated by what our genitals are. People who don't approve of what we do are really fascinated with what our gender is and try to use that as a weapon. But I think what we've talked about is that, drag is a really expansive art, and what it tends to be, I think, is like an amplification of self and identity. We like to do, when we do drag for Drag Story Hour, we think of ourselves kind of as fairy gay mothers. We're very whimsical in our drag that we bring to Drag Story Hours. It tends to be larger than life. I kind of look like I'm going to grant you some magical wish that's going to change your life in a Disney movie. So yeah, I mean, it's fun. I think a lot of people, when I'm out of drag and they hear, oh, I do Drag Story, or they say, do you dress as a man? And I say, no, I dress as this, kind of accentuation of femininity. Really, like, we do a lot of tulle and bright colors and big hair and just really accentuated, what is traditionally referred to as femininity. And I love that. I think it's really helped me find parts of myself in accentuating that when I'm in drag for Story Hour.
So, no matter what your position is on trans and non-binary identities, it is still a flatly wrong thing to refer to the performers as two gentlemen. Now, I want to be fair. I don't think it is reasonable for me to expect Becky to have known this. I cannot imagine she looked up much about the actual event beyond the name, much less went too far into looking into the offstage identities of the performers. It would not be fair of me to expect her to get this detail right. However, I do have an expectation of the newspaper that printed her words. I am personally of the opinion that if you are a journalistic outlet and you print someone's words, and those words are false, misleading, misinformed, or otherwise just plain wrong, you have a responsibility, if you're going to print those, to note that they are wrong. Because if you don't, then all you're doing is broadcasting and platforming misinformation, which is the opposite of what any newspaper is meant to do. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to feel that the newspaper should have put a note after Becky's quote stating that the two performers were not, in fact, men. And again, this is the case even if you don't respect non-binary identities. The fact that no such note is present means one of two things. Either the newspaper was aware of the false information contained in this quote and chose to make no note about the inaccuracy, or, and if I'm being honest, far more likely, the newspaper did so little research into the event and the people behind it that they didn't even know this basic information about the performers who are at the heart of the entire matter. Their offstage identities are not a secret and are not difficult to find, and of course, probably would have been known had the newspaper bothered to contact either one of them even once before this article ran. So either they knew it was wrong and let it slide, or the piece was so under-researched that they didn't know basic facts about the people that they were letting others talk about. I personally don't really find either of these to be acceptable. And while some out there may be inclined to be gentler on a small local paper, I'd actually argue they have an even greater responsibility when discussing local news to get it right. These are neighbors. These are people who have access to each other in some cases. You can't be wrong about this. And I really want to make this point here because this is a specific piece of misinformation, that would be repeated for days in numerous letters to the editor that would appear in the paper, but I don't hold the paper responsible for any of those. I know they publish most of the letters that are sent in, and they are clearly marked as the opinions of locals. For as often as I kept seeing the same false statements that the performers were men, I only expected the paper to do anything about it this one singular time. I don't expect them to vet the information on letters sent in by the public, but I do expect them to do it for their own articles, and they didn't. So add that to the unbalanced presentation of all the concerns coming from locals and the only defense coming from people presented as talking about and defending their jobs. And just in case, you might find yourself thinking, Vera, maybe you're being a little hard on this single local reporter. This is where I have to admit that there's a detail I've held back up to now. While the credited author of the piece is listed as a staff writer, and that is technically accurate, that's also not their only position at the paper. This article was written by the newspaper's editor. Specifically, the executive editor and general manager of the paper was who wrote this. In other words, the buck stops with them. And one more thing to note, the headline for the digital edition of this same article is far more inflammatory and isn't even trying to appear balanced. This article came out in the weekend edition for November 9th and 10th, and the event was scheduled for November 16th. I'm sure you can imagine what the letters section was like in the interim. And as I said, I will not subject you to the full text of any of this, but just to give you a taste and an idea of what it was like, here's some titles for you. Intro to Adult Entertainment for Kids at the Athenaeum. Reconsider Drag Story Hour at the Athenaeum. Normal or abnormal? Drag Story Hour, the real agenda. Reconsider Drag Story Hour. Is Drag Story Hour for children? Blackface Story Hour? I know it when I see it. Drag Story Hour exposed! And finally, I shit you not, Marxist Socialist Queering of America! It wasn't a pleasant stretch of time to be reading the opinion section of the paper.
I think for us, where we hit a nerve for a lot of people even more, is it's queerness mixed with children, which for some people that's like, oh my gosh, how could you ever do that? Not acknowledging that there's queer kids everywhere and there's kids with queer families and there's kids with queer friends.
But it wasn't without its uplifting moments as well, because as disheartening as those letters were to see, there were others who proved the falsehood of the article's framing, where all the voices of local residents were united in their dissent, because the reality was they ran plenty of letters with titles like this: Athenaeum models inclusion for everyone, Much Ado About Nothing, Editing the Editor, Response to the inflammatory article about Drag Story Hour, Support the Athenaeum in support of Drag Story Hour, Appreciation of the Athenaeum, Clearly Misinformed, Let's Learn Some More. Drag Story Hour deserves better than this. Full disclosure, I actually wrote that one. Drag Story Hour saves lives. How lucky we are! Drag Story Hour is good for the NEK. Now, in case you weren't counting, that was 10 negative letters and 13 supportive ones. And while I won't pretend that the community was anything other than divided, it's hardly the one-sided issue of locals versus librarians that the original article painted it as. And I'll note this here just because there isn't really a better place to put it. There was very little activity in the letters section after the event happened. However, there was a featured opinion piece from a local business supporter entitled "Intolerance is a Drag." Oh, and as an extra detail, one of those 10 negative letters was written by Karen. Karen as in the Karen who was interviewed in the original article that appeared in the weekend edition for the 9th and 10th, and her letter was printed on the 11th. So it wasn't even her responding to supportive letters or backlash against the article. She apparently felt that being the most quoted detractor in a front page article was an insufficient platform for her to voice her disgust at this upcoming event. Even aside from Karen, the letters attacking the event all had a similar flavor to the quotes in the original article, and they pretty much all started from the same core assumption: that atypical gender presentation is inherently sexual. Nearly all of these letters present the very existence of a person in drag as inherently sexual in nature and therefore inappropriate for family audiences, as if knowing that non-standard identities exist will transform innocent children into gooning Chan trolls overnight. The core assumptions these people operate on are that anything that is not heterosexual and cisgender is deviant, that it's not possible to acknowledge or discuss these topics without bringing sexual activity into it, and therefore it is never appropriate to have anyone apart from people who are heterosexual and cisgender in front of children. I mean, there's a logic to it. It's a logic based on falsehoods rooted in hatred and bigotry, but it's still logic of a kind. I'm now going to use the letters section to highlight a particular bugbear of mine. I found 2 letters that both engaged in a pretty common tactic used to drum up anger at these events. They referred readers to the social media of the 2 performers, Emoji Nightmare and Katniss Everqueer. Now, keep in mind that in the vast majority of their performances that aren't Drag Story Hour, Katniss and Emoji are playing to audiences of adults, often at bars or other venues where minors are not even permitted entry. And unsurprisingly, their social media footprint reflects that. Katniss in particular is an outspoken advocate for body positivity and makes no apologies for the amount of skin that shows up on something like her Instagram. And if you were to point concerned, confused, or just ill-informed parents at these posts and accounts, yeah, they might come away worried about what will be seen by children. But of course, this isn't representative of what happens at Drag Story Hour. There have been occasions in the past, not just with Vermont Drag Story Hour, but for the event in general, where detractors would just try to flatly deceive, taking footage from shows that were performed at clubs and intended for adult audiences by the drag performers, and then throw them up on social media claiming that they were from story hours. This is a tactic that's not as widespread as it was a few years ago because it's pretty easy to see through. So instead, you now get what we see here, the practice of just gesturing at the performers' activities outside of drag story hours and letting implication do all the work. And this particular tactic infuriates me. And just to make it clear how patently absurd and shallow it is, I'm going to take a little tangent. And we're going to talk about a man you may have heard of. His name was Bob Saget. Folks from my generation knew him best as the aggressively wholesome and deliberately boring father of the long-running sitcom Full House, or possibly as the milquetoast host of America's Funniest Home Videos. That was kind of like YouTube failure compilations from before the internet was a thing. His best-known work was wholesome, approachable, honestly a bit bland. That's what people saw on camera. Except he was also a stand-up comic. And he may have had one of the filthiest mouths of anyone to step up to a microphone.
I don't want to offend anybody. I want to offend everybody.
Father can't help himself, hauls back, smacks his wife right in the mouth, knocks all of her teeth out, sticks his fist, accidentally, mind you, down her toothless throat.
And she said, oh my God, I wanted you to be Danny Tanner. Why aren't you acting like Danny Tanner?
So they're all f***ing each other, right? All of a sudden, the kid can't take it. Diarrhea starts squirting out of his. It's like a hemorrhaging.
What do you want me to do, dust bust? I mean, like hug people, have a cardigan sweater, do the reach around? I don't know. I just want to apologize because a lot of people, I walk out and I just start talking and I see people's faces and a lot of nice ladies in the audience are like, and I'm like, you just keep your mouth like that, I'll be right there. Another girl said, you're not dirty enough. So I pissed on her and she liked it. And the VHS tape is climbing up the charts in Russia. It's doing really, really well.
And on the off chance you find yourself thinking, okay, well, maybe playing Danny Tanner on a grossly wholesome show for years made him just want to go in a different direction, just to rebel against that. Well, you're wrong, because here he is in 1984, 3 years before the first season of Full House.
But I'm a happy guy, because I got married my girlfriend of 7 years. At her age, I'm going to jail.
And also, Bob Saget is hardly a one-off. Shrek's best friend, Donkey, is voiced by Eddie Murphy, who spent the 80s telling jokes that to say that they aged badly would be a massive understatement.
It petrifies me because girls be hanging out with him. And one night they can be in the club having fun with their gay friend and give him a little kiss and go home with their AIDS on their lips.
And of course, there's Robin Williams, who never stopped jumping from family entertainment to rapid fire on stage obscenity.
A little sip of Perrier here. I had to stop drinking alcohol because I used to wake up nude in the hood of my car with my keys in my ass. I become my father going, your mother and I weren't online. We did lines, my friend, I'll tell you that. And we didn't have Twitter, we had shitter. That was my chat room.
But I focused on Bob Saget because I thought it better to just use a clear-cut example of somebody performing extraordinarily different material for adults than for children and family audiences. And the world, having managed to deal with that just fine at the time, revealing the insincerity of this entire line of attack. If you are okay with your kids watching Full House, then you have no business caring about what the Drag Story Hour performers do when they are performing for adult audiences. It is irrelevant. But of course, pretty much all the arguments against the event demonstrate quite handily that they didn't actually know what happened at Drag Story Hour. That's why they had to operate on the assumption of innate sexuality with the drag performers, or dig through the performer's social media presence to paint them as innately sexual, because if these people actually knew the first thing about the event and were describing it accurately, well, the whole thing would be pretty silly. The kinds of books read at drag story hours across the country, by and large, focus on notions of self-expression, being accepted by others, and being true to yourself. There are, sometimes, stories that touch on things like same-sex couples, such as the book Tango Makes Three, an absolutely adorable true story about two male penguins who raised a chick, or sometimes books that deal with forms of self-expression that fit into some version of queerness, like The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, Swish, Swish. But if you check the reading list for the organization, you'll also find a ton of staples like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, It's Okay to Be Different, and Where the Wild Things Are. And for the sake of full clarity, here's the list of books that were set to be read at this particular Drag Story Hour event. Read A Crayon Story, Bodies Are Cool, The Little Red Dress, A Big Guy Took My Ball, The Bad Seed, Princesses versus Dinosaurs. My Shadow is Purple. You don't have to love these books. You don't even have to like these books. But pornographic, they are not.
So many people think there's something so devious about Drag Story Hour because queerness and identity is at the center of it. And what it really is saying, hey, you're listening to these stories. If you see yourself in these stories, that's what we're so glad, because we understand you live in a world where you might not see yourself as much represented. And we understand that representation, it is not just important. It saves lives. It helps define people's lives. We have so many adults who come up to us after and say, oh my God, if this book had existed when I was a child, things would have been so different. If I had heard these words said to me, if I had met adult queer folks who were thriving, what that would have meant to me.
Some of these address identity issues in an accessible manner. Red, A Crayon Story, being the main one that kind of fits into that. But honestly, the very existence of a book like that is a rebuttal to how supposedly confusing this is for kids. I'll grant you what I'm about to say is anecdotal, but speaking as a parent, I always found what confuses kids more than anything is adults acting weird about stuff. Because kids don't know what your hangups are, nor do they have the level of emotional complexity to really even understand how that would influence things. But those hangups can and will shape your interactions with your kids nonetheless. I'm not a child psychologist, so take this with a grain of salt. But from my 40 plus years on this earth, my observation and memory as a child is that children are confused far more often when information is deliberately withheld from them than they are when information is presented to them in a format they can follow. And no, that doesn't mean you tell your kids everything about everything.
People think we're like going in there and giving lessons on queer sex to kids. Like, not at all. We're reading stories about princesses and dinosaurs and crayons. And yes, like we are reading books that are age appropriate for children to learn about certain identities, certain things we read. We model consent in this. When we're doing pictures, I make sure for every kiddo that comes up, I say, well, how would you like to take a picture? Would you like to sit? Would you like to stand? Is it okay if I put my arm around you? These are age appropriate ways to teach and model consent. We build all of these things in. It isn't just this willy-nilly thing where we're throwing drag on and grabbing some books.
But until the right has its way and all queer people are
eradicated from public life entirely.
And no, I'm not going to stop bringing up that clip. But until they accomplish that, the simple truth is that kids will see and encounter gay, trans, and genderqueer people in media, in their towns, among their classmates, and just out in the world. And you can either give them context for that, or you can deny them that, and then leave them confused and unable to healthily navigate the world that you are supposed to be preparing them for. Of course, this entire idea only applies if you don't think the visible existence of any kind of queerness is inherently evil and harmful, because if that is what you think, then it makes perfect sense to shield children from any and all of it. So, we've talked about the article that kicked off a local firestorm. We've talked about a week's worth of letters to the editor, so it's time to talk about what happened on the day. And yeah, I was there. On the day, there was a rather notably large number of people gathered in front of the Athenaeum, with those supporting the event gathering on either side of the entrance, while those who were opposed further off to the sides. Here's a panoramic shot I took for a sense of scale. It doesn't fully do it justice, though, because it should be understood that the supporters were gathered several rows deep, as you can kind of see with them extending down the side along the parking lot entrance. By comparison, the protest groups were not nearly as densely packed. I'll start with this. Things were about as civil as was ever going to be the case. There was no violence or threats of violence. There was one brief moment where an elderly man among the protesters ended up on the pavement, but he wasn't shoved. There was no actual incident. He lost his balance and was rather quickly treated by first responders from the fire station that was right next door, and he appeared to be fine after that. But other than that, it was incident-free. Now, there is an aspect of the attendance that I think should be brought up and acknowledged. It was not just the locals and the town residents. I can't really speak whether or not folks came from out of town to protest the event, but I do know a fair few folks came from out of town to support it. And by out of town, I mean like from the other side of the state. There was a strong showing of folks from Essex and Burlington, which has a more visible queer presence in general, being from a far more populous part of the state. Since groups like Essex Pride were aware that protests were likely, there was organizing done to ensure strong support on the day.
We had called for our supporters to show up. We were expecting there to be a fair amount of people supporting us out front and creating sort of that rainbow wall that would allow people to enter the building more safely.
And while I think it'd be dishonest of me to not acknowledge how many of the supporters were from other parts of the state and not from the NEK, don't misconstrue that as meaning that there were no locals there in support. There was a church group from down the street which came and supported the event. I spotted numerous folks who I know from town or from one or two towns over, which, again, I would consider to be more or less local. And I can't say whether the protesters were all locals or not because these aren't the kind of people I know or am friends with. There really isn't much to give in terms of a moment-by-moment recounting of things, but here's a few highlights. One of the protesters set up an amplifier and a microphone across the street from the event and started reading Bible verses. However, he was frequently interrupted by a supporter of the event going up to him and asking him questions and getting him into debates off the mic. I personally made the mistake of trying to talk to one of the protesters early on in the whole thing because I honestly just wanted an answer to what it was they thought actually happened at the events. Not like what they claimed, like, oh, it has this effect on children. What was it they actually thought happened in there? So I went up to an older gentleman who was holding a pretty generic Protect the Children style sign, tried to get an answer to that simple question. I don't know if he would have talked to me. He never really had the opportunity to respond because a much younger man butted in and began ranting about the indoctrination happening at the high school down the street. And at that point, I just disengaged, noting plainly and vocally that it was because of the younger man's aggression that I was going to leave and offered a handshake to the older man who I tried to talk to. He ignored that offer until I asked bluntly, "Are you afraid to shake my hand?" At which point he did so rather sheepishly, and I went back amongst the supporters. So not really a productive use of anybody's time, but I found it enlightening to have it confirmed to me that even if there are some protesters willing to maybe possibly converse, have a conversation, it doesn't really matter because there's others who will just want to jump on their bad faith talking points and will do so at the first opportunity. There was one rather large man carrying a protest sign who attempted to follow very closely behind a mother and child heading into the event in what really felt like an attempt at an intimidation tactic. However, supporters were able to get between him and the attendees and then slowed their walk speed down, which forced distance between him and the people going into the event. The benefits of de-escalation training. Oh, and for clarity, the only ones allowed into the event were the families actually showing up, so parents and their kids. None of the protesters, supporters, or people who didn't like it were allowed in.
This library made a decision, which we've had it happen a couple of times. We normally don't censor or restrict who can come to our story hours at all. They did make the decision because of just the volatility in this and also just the size. I think you had to have a child with you to attend the story hour, which sometimes is a way for a lot of these organizers are, adults who don't have children or whose children are grown children. They're not even folks who would be attending this program.
There were also quite a few honks from cars and pickups that drove by, and because of things like thumbs up given to the supporting group, it was pretty clear who they were supporting, even though honk in general is kind of generic. But there was a lot to affirm very genuine local support of the event. There were supporters in cosplay, as books, which was just cute. And there were various points where the supporters played music to keep spirits high and drown out the protest voices. It basically became a Chapel Roan sing-along for a little bit. And ultimately, it was the largest turnout ever for Drag Story Hour in Vermont, even more so than in far more populous areas. And after the event proper, both Katniss and Emoji came out to express their gratitude for the support.
As you can see, there is so much more joy here than there is hatred.
And honestly, the fact that they felt safe enough to come out the front door, that alone felt like a bit of a big deal, because there was a plan in place for them to be able to exit out a back entrance if it was deemed necessary for safety.
We had over 100 people show up to stand outside that library to protect us and protect the families and attendees who were doing that, because they believe that this is an important thing.
And the Monday following the event, there was a new front page article from a different staff writer. This one titled, "Drag Story Hour Sees Record Turnout, Strong Support." This story featured the actual balance the previous article sorely lacked. It included quotes from the director of the Athenaeum, one of the protesters, the president of Essex Pride, a mother who brought her child to the event, Emoji Nightmare, and a queer local, aka me. And if you find yourself going, oh, hold on, isn't this just unbalanced from the other way around that the last one was? They talked to way more people in favor of this thing than they talked to the protesters. I'm going to point out a few things. Firstly, given the way the previous article was balanced, this would seem more than fair to me, but I'm actually going to argue that this isn't even unbalanced, because the protesters were given some voice, and it was given the appropriate weight in conjunction with their actual presence. They were one of multiple interested parties, and they were quantifiably among the smallest. I'll direct you to a point that's been made about the so-called debate over climate change. While it may seem and look and feel balanced to have a debate between one person arguing climate change is real and needs to be addressed immediately, and one person arguing that it's fake, if you were to actually represent the scientific consensus on the issue, a true representative balance would be one person arguing it's fake against 99 qualified experts.
In the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. This is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion.
Balance isn't just representing both sides, it's being proportional about their weight, lest you inflate just how widespread a view actually is or how much evidence or validity it has in the first place. Drag Story Hour isn't pornographic. It's not grooming. It's not indoctrination. It's two people looking like fairy princesses reading books about kindness and uniqueness to children whose parents are in the room with them and can take them out at any moment should they feel it is not safe for their children. But education won't help when it comes to people who think that it's harmful because they refuse to learn about or engage with the event or the people who see its value. The tactic is to decry, and keep pushing so that people who only know what they've heard about hear things about Drag Story Hour and think, well, there has to be something to all the concern. People wouldn't be this worked up over nothing. This is the narrative that initial article fed into and fueled, whether it intended to or not.
We had one family or one group of people who did come into the story time who prayed for the first part of the story time. It was I think father, child, and grandmother, and then they prayed silently in the back. So, that was a form of kind of quiet protest in that. I noticed it. Emoji didn't even notice it. They were at the back of the room. They left about halfway through. So, that was one time where we had a protester actually come into the space, but it was done in a very subtle way. I think they did what they needed to do, and we were still able to do what we needed to do.
But the actual event brought out something else. It brought out support from those local and those a bit further away willing to lend their voices. It brought people honking and cheering the event, even as others held up generic protect the children signs and refused to meaningfully engage with what was actually going on. It brought more voices of support than it did of derision at the event and even in the letters page of the paper that kicked off the shitstorm by opting to give a platform to voices who see any deviation from what they understand as aberrant and in need of removal rather than just a simple announcement like they would have done for any other event held at the same location.
A lot of the folks that we had who were doing counter protests were teens, local teens, and they were out there on the front steps wearing, rainbow shirts with signs that say love is love. And I just, that warmed my heart so much to see local, tweens and teens showing up so that the little kids in their community could hear these stories. And it also broke my heart because they're standing there so bravely and so boldly, as adults are telling them that they are deviants and that they're going to hell and that their identity doesn't exist or doesn't belong or is corrupt. And so that piece felt very heartbreaking, but I felt so proud of these young, allies and young queer folks who showed up and said, this matters in our community and we really deeply care.
One of the things I've always said about Vermont, and part of the reason I make this state my home, is that the general attitude of people is, that's none of my business. Even in the NEK, one of the more conservative areas of the state, where Trump signs are not as uncommon as I would like them to be, I've not been heckled, confronted, or intimidated. Because despite disagreements, the state overall opts for live and let live. I don't really care what you do, more often than not. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who believe there is something fundamentally wrong with me and anyone else who clocks as queer. And through all this, I saw a side of the NEK that I'd rather not have seen. At the same time, though, I saw more people willing to open their arms and say, you're welcome here and you're safe, than I saw people who would be happy to never see me again.
I think this is the thing is the folks who were protesting, they say our community doesn't want it. And they're speaking on their community as this monolith, but clearly many members of the community did. We broke a record with this story hour. We had, I think it was 170 people in the story hour inside the gallery in St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. We broke records there. So your community does want this. There's many members of your community who do want this.
I'm sure there are those who will argue that events like Drag Story Hour divide us. I don't think that's true. It can, regrettably, bring to light divisions that we tend to just smile through and not bring up in polite conversation. But in the end, it brought more people together than it did push apart. And I'm proud to have been there.
It was pretty warming, I would say, despite the hula hoop, the cartwheels of emotions, and that we were doing up until the event. So everything went off well, and it all worked out.
It was very, very heartwarming, and very powerful to see community show up like that. As we were driving away, I said to Emoji, I said, that's one of my proudest days.
I'd really hoped to have this video out earlier into Pride Month, but that just wasn't meant to be. But I hope that you have found this helpful, enlightening, as a look at the microcosm of what Drag Story Hour can be and what it can be like to exist as queer in a rural area. And don't take that as representative of all parts of the country. Even a more conservative part of Vermont is going to be measured differently than literally any part of the rural South. But I want to thank you for listening and for sticking through to the end. And if you have enjoyed this video and want to support what I do, like, share, subscribe, that stuff. that all helps. But I also have a Patreon, which helps me do this as my full-time job. This is indeed my living. This particular kind of video is not my typical output, but I probably wouldn't have the time to invest in videos like this if this wasn't my full-time job, thanks to things like the support of Patreon and YouTube members. But what I really want you to remember at the end of all this, more than anything, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now it's time to thank my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Quite Bearish, Zubin Lutfula, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casper, Dave Hall, Andre, Movie Turtle, Oliver B, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Mary Mello, Iron, Becky Sparks, Loki Eris, Tracy Scrabbit, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. We have a new little guy here under my hair. That's Satyr. So yes, he can now join in the distraction chorus as I try to read names. Thanks, guys. Welcome to the family.